I'm going to play for you all an audio clip at the end of this data log, so you can all take part in this experiment. But please, listen to this in its entirety first, so you may better understand the repercussions of your decision to do so. Please understand that it is your sole decision to listen to it or not. You have been warned. Before we get to that, I think I should start by explaining our inspiration for this experiment, and what exactly INFRA-SOUND is. It all started with my team discussing a tragic Russian expedition that happened many years ago. Today, people refer to it as the Dyatlov Pass incident. If you've never heard of it, I'll be providing a brief summary regarding the incident. It is a true occurrence, and you can read the Wikipedia page for more information if you like. In 1959, 9 experienced hikers and skiers set off on an expedition through a very remote area of the Ural Mountains. They would never return. When family and friends failed to hear back from them, a search party was dispatched. What they discovered has perplexed many investigators to this very day. Their tent, you see, was cut open from the inside, even though its zipper was intact and appeared to be in functioning order. It was surmised that the group must have rushed out of the tent as though their lives depended on it. Most of the group didn't even leave the tent dressed properly for the sub-zero weather. Some of them felt they didn't even have enough time to put on their shoes, and ran through the snow barefoot. All 9 frozen bodies were discovered up to a mile away from the tent. The cause of death for most involved was exposure to the elements. However, 4 out of the 9 had sustained strange injuries during this time. 3 of the expeditioners had major skull damage and chest fractures to each of them, though the force required to cause the damage would had to have been extremely high. Investigators compared the force needed to that of a vehicle collision. What was peculiar about these injuries was that there were no external wounds relating in any way, almost as if they were subjected to an intense level of pressure. The last member did have external wounds. A woman was lying face down in a stream. Her eyes and tongue, as well as parts of her lips, were missing. She did have damage to her skull as well, though the evidence was inconclusive. Strange incident, wouldn't you say? Numerous questions seemed to arise when discussing this incident. Why had they all left the tent? Why did they not take their clothing, their food, their supplies, even their shoes? Some have speculated that maybe they heard what they thought was an approaching avalanche, but there was no evidence of one occurring anywhere near where they were found. Also, it was assumed that they were all far too experienced in those mountains to be fooled by such a thing. Additionally, there were no other footprints in the snow other than the 9 victims, so it would appear they were not attacked by another group of people or even wild animals. No drugs found, no alcohol involved. There seemed to be no explanation for the entire thing. None, that is, if you've never heard of infrasound before. The wind cutting through the valley of the pass would have been the perfect condition for it. Infrasound. A deep rumbling at such a low frequency that your conscious mind can't hear it. But your subconscious mind? It hears it loud and clear. And it evokes a sense of terror. At the right infrasound frequency, you'll be filled with a horror you can't even describe or even understand. You may hear voices. You may see visions. You may even be compelled to do things. Some believe that infrasound is the cause of all alleged supernatural events in the world. A valley with a history of UFO sightings, quite possibly infrasound. A hotel room with a reputation of being haunted, infrasound. an alleyway outside where strange things are reported to occur. The way the wind passes through it likely creates infrasound. A church where the congregation has a reputation for speaking in tongues. You guessed it. The church was likely at a location where infrasound occurred naturally. Now, imagine, if you will, harnessing such a power, of understanding the specifics of these infrasound frequencies, and using them against a hostile enemy. Well, that's what my research team set out to do. Our funding allowed for 8 volunteers who agreed to be filmed and recorded while locked in a testing area for 5 days. On each subsequent day, we upped the frequency to a more intense level of infrasound. It took only 3 days before the experiment was ultimately canceled and we lost our funding. I will now detail the results of the experiment for you. Day 1. We started with a modestly low frequency this day. 7 of the 8 participants behaved entirely normal all 24 hours. Some told us that they felt a little more anxious than usual, but it was nothing unbearable and could possibly be attributed to the uniqueness of the situation. One of the participants, however, had a mild panic attack. He said nothing like it had ever happened to him before in his entire life. He felt such a dread that it made it difficult for him to breathe. But eventually it had passed, and he decided to stay on as part of the experiment. Day 2. We doubled the frequency this day, and we witnessed a much more unusual response. One man shut down entirely and refused to speak to anyone. He was looking around the room erratically, staring at things that weren't really there. His eyes would stare up at the ceiling and then swing down wildly to the floor, as though he were watching something climb around on the walls at a very fast pace. Another man mumbled to himself for hours. It was difficult to hear through the implanted microphones, but it sounded like he was saying, "It's going to kill me. It's going to kill me," over and over and over again. In the early afternoon of the experiment, a woman began screaming. She was looking at the television and would sometimes shout, "It can't be." No matter what anybody said to her, she wouldn't look away from the TV and would not stop screaming. It became higher in pitch and was unbearable to anybody near her. The most puzzling part? The television wasn't even turned on. We had to remove that woman from the experiment. She gathered her composure within minutes of being away from the infrasound, but she has never told us what appeared to her on the television screen. From what we know, she still to this day never looks at another television if she can help it. She can't bear it, she says. It just reminds her of what she saw that day. An interesting observation. The man that had a panic attack on the first day was perfectly fine on day 2, which seems to show it's not always the intensity of the frequencies that affects people. The remaining 4 subjects showed no visible signs of distress. Day 3. We tripled the frequency from day 2. To be clear, that's 6 times stronger than day 1. It only lasted about 20 minutes before we turned it off and were forced to cease the experiment. One man, a subject who previously had shown no reactions to the sound, within just under 2 minutes, walked to a corner and started bashing his skull into the wall. He was bleeding by the 3rd hit, but he still did it at least 10 more times before knocking himself out. Another man held his hands over his ears and kept shouting, "Stop them from whispering. I don't want to hear them." Another woman ran to the locked door and slammed her hands upon it, trying to escape. After 10 minutes, her hands had crumpled into broken masses attached to the wrists. Still, she continued hitting the door. My colleagues ended it there. I spoke out against them. I told them it was for science, that the victims had volunteered for this, and that the ends can justify the means. But they told me I had lost sight of things. One even called me insane. My colleagues won that day. The experiment was shut down. But my quest for scientific knowledge on the subject has not ended, and it never will. I have enormous plans for INFRA-SOUND, but I need to do some more preliminary experiments with a much larger sample size. That's where all of you come in. I have taken the frequency from day 3 of the experiment and created a 30-second audio file. And I would ask of you now if you would like to be part of the INFRA-SOUND experiments. Listen to it. Report the effects in the comment section below. Most of you will hear nothing and feel nothing at all. That's fine. Still, comment. Others may hear a faint rumbling sound. Others may begin to see strange visuals or possibly hear voices. Or possibly worse. Possibly far worse. Report it all below, but only do so if you would like to participate in science. I will not force you. It's true, I could have tricked you all into listening to INFRA-SOUND the entire time, but I would never do that. Regardless of my colleagues' wry criticism, I am not insane. I only work on a volunteer basis. Yes, I know it seems ridiculous that I'm asking you all to do something that resulted in people choosing to freeze to death in the snow, smash their heads against the wall, and bash their hands against the door until they shattered. But if you're scared, then simply don't listen to it. Nobody is forcing you to do so. But if you're brave enough to venture a listen, keep in mind it's only 30 seconds. It should stop before any serious damage can happen. You most likely won't hear anything at all. Don't report in what you hear. Report on how it makes you feel. So, without further ado, listen at your own peril. In the name of science.